Hey there, folks. So welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, for another unscripted movie review, we're going to be talking about the newest teenage coming-of-age story from Greg Berlanti, Love, Simon. So, there's basically, for me, something of a sliding scale when it comes to these teenage comedy drama stories. On the one hand, on the far, far side, that's the most hyper stylized and where the cinematic language is the most potent, or at least the most forward, you get shows like Riverdale or Glee, where you can tell they might tilt a little bit more towards naturalism, but they're also clearly speaking in larger archetypes. They're going over the top, and if you can get sucked into some of the melodrama, they can be pretty enjoyable. On the far other side, you have films like Lady Bird that came out last year from Greta Gerwig that was extremely naturalistic, and it felt like something that you could imagine real people actually doing. It felt very grounded. It doesn't typically have a lot of high stakes. A lot of the drama is conveyed more subtly, and yet, if you pay attention, and a lot of film critics don't quite give this the amount of credit that they deserve, is that a lot of these more naturalistic elements is that the film language can still be just as potent without being showy about it, and that's something that doesn't quite get the same amount of respect. Now, the film writer, film critic Hulk pointed out this, and I actually want you to go check out his piece talking about films like Lady Bird. I've got it linked in the description below. It really is quite excellent. But the typical thing you realize is that both these particular ends of the spectrum rely on a certain amount of cinematic language that you would expect from more challenging, accomplished directors. Then you have somewhere in the middle, where you get a lot of the typical teenage Hallmark movies that don't quite seem to have the same command of the cinematic language, but are still trying to convey that relatable teenage ideal. Just make it a little bit bigger, the drama a little bit more heightened to draw people into that narrative, feel a little bit more simplistic, sure, but sometimes it can really work. And into this, you get a lot of John Hughes' movies. You get films like Clueless and 10 Things I Hate About You. Then you get films in the 2000s like Superbad or Mean Girls. And right here, this is where also I would put Love, Simon, which is your teenage coming-of-age story with the big main twist, and it's already been exposed by entirely too much of the marketing. The main character, Simon, is gay. Now, he's currently in the closet for the majority of this movie up until the outing moment, and yes, it comes as heavily handed as you might expect, but the main thrust of the narrative is actually a little bit more low-key than that. On the school's blogging gossip sphere, somebody puts out anonymously that they are gay, and Simon reaches out to this person. They start a back and forth communication through Gmail that they try to figure out who each other's are, and they inspire each other to become more comfortable in their skin as gay. Now, as in terms of that level of stakes, it's pretty low key. A lot of the acting, that in order to carry a lot of that, it's done pretty well. I will say some of the characters can feel a little not flat, but lacking a little greater dimension. The dialogue doesn't quite snap in the same way that a Judd Apatow movie might, but at the same time, for what this film is trying to be, it's trying to be that starry-eyed, very earnest teenage love story set in the same vein as a John Hughes film. Hell, that's why they got Jack Antonoff to do so much of the soundtrack curation, because effectively so much of the music coming off of Strange Desire was written as if it was gonna be in a John Hughes film. The fact that Wild Heart shows up at a very key moment of this movie, it's obvious, sure, but I'm not denying that it isn't emotionally effective. When you get some of that crackerjack moments, when this movie is at its best, it plays into that loose teenage chemistry that isn't quite the same level of deeply grounded naturalism that would highlight so much of Lady Bird or Greta Gerwig, but this movie is trying to be a little bit more stylized. I get that. It is trying to capture some of that heights of earnest teenage emotion, and that's something I do respect, especially coming in that lane. The problem is that for as much as that this movie's trying to be that, I'm not sure it's quite as tight as it needs to be in order to pull it off. When you take a look at what Greg Berlanti has done in the past, a lot of it's based on TV, specifically Dawson's Creek, and I've got loaded issues to that show that we're not getting into right here. But at the same time, it's aiming to play as a little bit more TV-ish in some of the framing and some of the shot composition and direction. Greg Berlanti has primarily worked in TV. One of the first film that he was a feature-length director on, The Broken Hearts Club, it actually did feature a lot of similar naturalistic gay performances in that lane, except with a lot more adult characters. And yeah, it's all right, I guess, but it suffers the same sort of tepid command of the cinematic language that I think this movie does. And at the same time, I think there are script issues as well, specifically when it comes to pacing. Not that it's a badly paced movie, it's not nearly as tight as Lady Bird was, and take a look at a movie like Superbad. As much as I love that film, that movie has pacing issues up the ass when it comes to driving cinematic momentum. But this film's issue is that it really could have used a little bit more room to breathe and let more of the characters develop a little bit more beyond the two-dimensional sketches. Outside of Simon, who really is a fully fleshed out, articulated character, and there are some high concept moments, like an imagined scene where kids have to come out to their parents as straight, which I thought was one of the funniest things I had seen really this far in movies this year. But at the same time, you do wish that some elements of narrative momentum played out a little bit better, and just with a little bit more tightness in the script. Maybe a second draft could have polished up some of the lines, couldn't feel quite as thuddingly on the nose as some of this was. I get that some of it was the point, and you get this coming from a teenage movie, but at least when you had someone like John Hughes, it had some of that lived-in quality that I think this film doesn't quite inhabit to the same degree. Yes, it plays to a very modern sensibility, and I respect the hell out of that, especially when it comes to the cast of characters, a lot of the main relationships that will percolate out of that, and how well it presents a small-town America who is mostly accepting of somebody who would come out as gay. Like, we have reached that point. It's certainly more enlightened than I would expect this movie to be, but there are some gripes I have when it comes to the script. For one, when the outing happens, I'm not going to spoil how it happens because I think it's, again, leads to some of the most awkward moments in the film, and I'm not a guy who does well with broad, awkward humor, even though, again, I get why that part of the movie was there. But at the same time, you would think for a town that was trying to be as liberal and enlightened as it is framed in this movie, that someone getting outed against their will would be framed a little bit more, there'd be more dramatic stakes to it beyond just that for Simon. And you would see some of that come through in, I don't know, the parents or the people who involved who actually did it, that the person who actually did the outing would suffer more deep and direct consequences and that it wouldn't cascade back on Simon. Again, that might be somewhat realistic, that the person who outs doesn't typically get called out for it, but it did ring as a bit of a sour note there for me, especially with anyone with the real knowledge of what some of that environment actually is. And at the same time, the final reveal of who the person that Simon's writing to, I'm not going to say it's a bad choice, and because I do think these actors actually have a fair amount of chemistry that was telegraphed earlier in the film, but I do think, again, it was a moment that was played more broadly, was trying to reach a more naturalistic conclusion of it all, but at the same time, I'm not sure meshing those tonal elements came together as well, and I do wish that more time had been spent actually fleshing out those characters. Now, the characters inside of Simon's social group, well, especially the two female characters who are his close friends, Leah and Abby, they actually do get a fair amount of dimension, and I do appreciate that the framing of this movie isn't quite calling out any one subset of characters as the villain. That does call back to a certain John Hughes variety and painting everybody as just flawed, frustrated people. But at the same time, you can also tell that the plot mechanisms are kind of straining to push them apart, especially when you get that typical end of second act breakup moment. In this particular moment, yeah, it's effective when it comes down to the teenage element, but for as close friends as they have been for so long, for them to pull that split the way they did, it felt really heavy-handed, and it didn't feel like the plot mechanisms fully backed it up. That said, this movie does have a few moments that I think are absolutely stellar. I really do love the moments where we get a little bit more inside Simon's head. When it does tilt into the more naturalistic elements, there's a great little conversational scene that does play as a tad twee, especially with the songwriting choices, but when it's paired with Simon and Leah, they have a conversational moment where a lot of the subtext comes through really well there from both the actors. They play off each other well. Again, it's trying for a very tight John Hughes variety, but John Hughes was willing to take a few more chances and let more of the edges come through in his characters. In this film, it feels like a lot of the edges have been sanded off very effectively. In other words, it doesn't quite cut the same way that you would otherwise see. This is where a lot of critics have said this movie, yeah, it's very sweet, it's very cute, we certainly respect it in that vein, but it's not doing anything that, say, Degrassi or, to speak of the matter, Glee have not done before. And I'd agree with that. Again, this is ground that I think has been played better in TV, but at the same time, for this sort of fluffy teenage love story, where it's all framed as the normal teenage love story, which again, I think it's a little bit on the nose, and I'm not sure that casting Simon as conventional as he is when it comes to certain very mainstream definitions of conventional that I even think the teens of today might kind of balk at. That kind of rubbed me the wrong way a little bit, but beyond that, it's sweet, and for this sort of fluffy teenage love story, we've seen enough with the heterosexual couples, why not get a homosexual couple in on it? And for that sort of coming of age story, for the teenagers in the right demographic, and for as well as it plays out, yeah, I think there is an audience for this. I think it's a little bit too smooth at the edges. I wish it paced itself a little bit better. I wish the script was a little bit sharper. But hey, that's coming from somebody who's seen Superbad entirely too many times and who does wish that films play into more of the dynamic of how teenagers actually act and behave. But beyond that, yeah, it's good. I think it's very enjoyable. There's a certain heartfelt moment between Simon and his father that I think plays out. It hits the right emotional beats that I certainly respect. And so yeah, for me, I'm thinking a extremely light 7 out of 10. And yeah, it's worth a listen if you're curious. I wouldn't quite say it's a must-see movie, but yeah, it's enjoyable. Sorry, my throat's a little bit raspy. I've been getting over this ugly cough for the past couple of days and trying to sand that edge back. But we're working on it, and if you guys got the poll up there, if you guys want to say how wrong I am, overall I think it's an okay, pretty good movie. I think the very light 7 is appropriate. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. I don't quite have the same naturalistic command of filmmaking as Greta Gerwig did, because again, if you haven't seen Lady Bird, go see it. It's an amazing film, just beautiful command of language, and I didn't think I'd like it as much as I did. Beyond that, if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process or support this channel, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. More details right over there. If you want to see the schedule, it's linked on my Instagram down there below. I'm going to be restructuring my Patreon in probably the next coming weeks, so stay tuned for a video discussing more of that if you guys want to get in on it. But until next time, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.